Once upon a time, in a small suburban school, there lived a boy named Johnny. Johnny was known for his cheeky behavior and his ability to turn any ordinary situation into a hilarious one. His classroom was no exception. Mrs. Thompson, a stern but well-meaning teacher, stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, ready to teach her students about fractions. The blackboard displayed a complex equation, and the students squirmed in their seats, dreading the impending math lesson. Johnny, however, saw this as an opportunity for mischief. He leaned over to his best friend, Timmy, and whispered, "Johnny, watch this, Timmy. I'm going to make Mrs. Thompson lose her cool." "Timmy, what are you planning, Johnny?" "Johnny, just wait." Mrs. Thompson, "Class, today we'll learn about fractions. Now, pay attention. If you have a pizza and you cut it into 8 equal slices." "Johnny," raising his hand. "Mrs. Thompson, I have a question." Mrs. Thompson, sighing, "Yes, Johnny?" "Johnny, what if the pizza is square? Does that mean we have to cut it into square slices?" The class erupted in laughter. Mrs. Thompson's face turned a shade of crimson that matched the red apples on her desk. Mrs. Thompson, "Johnny, we're talking about fractions, not pizza shapes." Johnny, innocently, "But Mrs. Thompson, I thought math was all about real-life situations. And in real life, I've never seen a round pizza. It's always square or rectangular." Timmy buried his face in his hands, trying not to laugh out loud. Mrs. Thompson, through gritted teeth, "Johnny, let's stick to the lesson. Now, if you have 3/4 of a pizza." Johnny, interrupting, "Wait, Mrs. Thompson, what if the pizza has pepperoni? Does each pepperoni count as a fraction too?" The class erupted again, and Mrs. Thompson's patience wavered. Mrs. Thompson, "Johnny, please focus. Pepperoni doesn't affect fractions. Now, let's move on." Johnny, leaning back in his chair, Okay, but what if the pizza is gluten-free? Does that change the fraction?" Mrs. Thompson's eye twitched. She took a deep breath. Mrs. Thompson, "Johnny, gluten has nothing to do with fractions. Let's—" Johnny, grinning, "But Mrs. Thompson, I heard gluten-free pizza is healthier. So, maybe it's 3/5 healthy and 2/5 delicious?" The class erupted into uncontrollable laughter. Mrs. Thompson's patience finally snapped. Mrs. Thompson, "Johnny, to the principal's office. Now." Johnny winked at Timmy as he left the room. As he walked down the hallway, he whispered, "Johnny, Timmy, I think I just discovered a new math branch, pizzanomics." And that's how Johnny became the unofficial pizza expert of Mrs. Thompson's class. His mischievous antics continued, but somehow, he managed to learn fractions, mostly by calculating the number of pepperoni slices on his favorite pizza. And so, the legend of Johnny, the pizza-loving math prodigy, lives on in the hallowed halls of that suburban school.